think there are primary issues and primary identities and secondary issues and secondary identities. I don't believe that abortion truly energizes people. It's a secondary, it's a proxy for identity. I think everything comes down to identity, and people with shreds of traditional ties to identity, to a local city or a local state or a particular way of life, or to a religion, or to traditional ideas of family, are going to use things like abortions as proxy to try to maintain their way of life. I think relatively few people actually care intensely about abortion, but tens of millions of people will be energized by abortion because it's a proxy for something deeper, which usually comes down to matters of identity.
And now, Luke, before we do move on, because I suppose as hot button of an issue as abortion is, there's only so much one could say about it. Uh, why do you think that so many on the right, who are obviously concerned with political demographics trending against them strongly, and I obviously do agree with you that there's no way this Texas law pans out well for the GOP electorally speaking, but why do you suppose there's so many of these conservatives who are obsessed with the Democrats getting more and more of the electorate, then oppose abortion, knowing that if there are no abortions, the Democratic share of the electorate increases exponentially? Oh, well, I guess maybe I've gone ahead of myself. Do you think it's that they don't know this, or do you think they do know it and they don't care? Do you think it's some sort of, something else? What's your take on the matter?
Well, I think when you can't say things out loud, people become more reluctant to even think things. So obviously, different peoples have different gifts, but you can't say this out loud with any specificity, or you are removed from polite society. So therefore, because you can't say such an obvious thing, that the average gifts of Ashkenazi Jews are different from the average gifts of Japanese, which are different from the average gifts of sub-Saharan Africans, and different from the average gifts of Eskimos. All right. So because you can't say such a basic thing out loud, people in positions of importance, positions of fame, positions of influence are reluctant not just to say these things out loud, but even to think them. So because you can't talk about the demographic repercussions of abortion out loud, what you just said, that this would be frowned upon, therefore I think many people refuse even to think about these things, because they know that if they think about, say, group differences or demographics, that they will be that much closer to saying something out loud. Like a lot of people think, oh, I'll just say it to my friends, but then somehow it spills out. So I think people are afraid to even think the truth, to even deal with the profound consequences of the demographic repercussions of abortion, as you just mentioned. People are so afraid of being associated with the word eugenic that they won't even think in ways that are eugenic or dysgenic. And so then they end up in some kind of bizarro land that is quite disconnected from reality.
Indeed. And that's where a lot of conservatives are. I mean, they'd have to know deep down that anti abortion is not good for them, or they might have some inkling of it, but they just shoo it away and they instead focus on the moral side of this, or perhaps a short term political pragmatism. They think we'll be able to get more voters by pandering to them on this issue. But it's really a sad situation on the whole, because the left is not focused on its long term benefit, which would be anti abortion. It would be shoring up its own demographic power, I had no question. And then the right is not focused on its own long term benefit either. It's focused on, I think ridiculous things instead. Both sides here, there's a lot of blame to go around, and neither one is acting in its best interests.
I think identity is, like everything else, is contingent and contextual and takes place within a wider culture. So you had Roe v. Wade. You had this from everything that I've read by legal experts. This was just a horrific ruling on a legal basis. There was no basis in law for Roe v. Wade. That has then repercussions. And so suddenly people who'd never cared or thought about abortion, they were triggered by Roe v. Wade and the horribleness of this ruling to suddenly take abortion seriously and to push back against Roe v. Wade. So all sorts of people, for example, who never thought strongly about Christianity are now suddenly coming around to embracing a muscular version of Christianity that they would never have done so if not for the overreach of the secular left. Here's an analogy. I visited England in 2005, And within an hour or two of getting off the plane and going to a pub, I found myself speaking in an exaggerated Australian accent, and I didn't know why I was doing it. I didn't know why I was going, "Oi, mate!" Like, why was I carrying on in some exaggerated? But that context of being in England, it suddenly brought out what was usually latent in me. I don't normally go around like an Australian larrikin, but that context suddenly brought out the Australian in me. So the context, as America's context changes, all sorts of identities that are latent in people suddenly come out. People who never thought about being white are suddenly thinking about being white. People who never thought about muscular Christianity are suddenly thinking about muscular Christianity. People who've never given a damn about states' rights are suddenly thinking about states' rights. People who've never cared one way or another about homosexuals, once you have homosexual marriage as the law of the land, suddenly they have an instinctive reaction to it. People who've never thought about transsexuals, once they see it being extensively celebrated and even mandated that we celebrate it in the media, they suddenly have a reaction against it. So what is identity? Identity comes out depending on context. So in one context, my conservative side is going to come out. In another context, my Orthodox Jewish side is going to come out. In another context, my Australian heritage is going to come out. In another context, my Anglo heritage is going to come out. In another context, my American identity is going to come out. In another context, my Los Angeles or Californian identity is going to come out. When we had that recent big submarine deal between the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom, suddenly like my Anglo identity got triggered. It's like, this is fantastic. The Anglo powers are uniting to do something wonderful that's going to push back against growing Chinese influence. This is going to be good for Australia. This is going to be good for the United States. So it would be good for the whole Anglosphere. And so an identity that was reasonably latent in me suddenly became primary in reaction to events. So when Harold Macmillan, I think, was asked in the 1950s what would determine the success of his government, I believe he answered events, my dear boy, events. Yes. And events also have a profound effect on our identity. In one context, our primary identity may well be Christian or Jewish. And in a different context, it may be Texan or conservative or Southern or Anglo. So as events change and contexts change, our identities, what was latent or buried in us, will come to the fore. So when Israel won the 1967 war on a massive basis, millions of Jews who had very little Jewish identity suddenly became hyper-chauvinist Jews. It just came out of nowhere. It shocked them. And it's, as Tom Wolfe said, back to blood. Blood is probably the most basic and primal of all identities. And in a growing age of confusion, then often these most primal identities will come to the.
I agree entirely. I don't think there's really any two ways about what you said. I think it's just a fact of human nature, all what you've related, and it very much is what it is. And I will say, though, if you have a reasonable, responsible question or comment for Luke or myself, please leave it via Streamlabs. Thank you very much in advance. And now talking about our last, at least the last issue that I have marked down here for tonight. It is the matter of Afghanistan, how what happened there happened.